and now for another episode of Something Simple. We have a question about Sunday obligation. When certain scenarios come up, is it a sin to miss Mass or is it not?
Basically, we presume that you know you're obliged to go to Mass every Sunday and every holy day of obligation, right? Good. I think we did a little video about that on another occasion. What happens when it's tricky, right? So for example, like, what if you're sick? What happens then?
So there's a principle. An obligation is not an obligation when it cannot be fulfilled.
No one is bound to the impossible.
Right. God isn't going to condemn us for some impossible situation. With that, we need to parse, I think, further through, just kind of briefly but clearly. There's some common scenarios that come up. Some of them are legitimate reasons and some of them aren't. So, Father, could you maybe begin to take us through some of those?
If you're sick or someone that you have care for is sick and you couldn't leave them alone, and if it's the kind of thing that you really can't leave, right? And you wouldn't leave for some other reason, like you wouldn't leave to go to the store or, on a social visit or things like this, right? If you wouldn't do those other things, that's probably about the right point where you're like, yeah, I'm no longer obligated to go to Mass. If it's like a cold, that might be the kind of thing that you would go to the store or you would go visit a friend, right? If you would do those things, you probably should go to Mass too, right? That's a quick and ready kind of way to understand. Now, if you aren't sick, but your kid is, or if you're caring for your elderly relative, or for someone who's disabled, or whatever, if you have legitimate caretaking responsibilities and you could not leave for the length of time that you'd be gone to go to Mass, you're no longer obliged to go to Mass because you have a legitimate obligation to that person. Some other things that would impose legitimate obligations upon us would be possibly working.
Yes.
There are some people who might be no longer obliged to go to Mass because of their work. Let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so some are clearer than others because we need law enforcement even on the Lord's Day. We need medical people, healthcare, physicians dealing with emergencies, even on the Immaculate Conception and All Saints' Day and these other holy days of obligation. So those are clearly not going to be sinful to be working on those days because there's different divisions of labor. But then I think there's another category that may be less clear, but still very common today, and that can be with a society not recognizing these ecclesiastical laws, these laws of the church, that, well, if the church obliges me to keep holy these days, but I can't find gainful employment that respects this. One, we should assert our rights, but if you have a family, or again, to provide for yourself, there can be some reasons that are sufficient to see to it that you don't lose your job and
Right. We should not too easily dispense ourselves from the Sunday obligation. So in a situation like that, where you have a job that requires you to work on Sunday and you really couldn't get another job, let's say that this happens, and you're unable to come to Mass on Sunday, come talk to your priest, and let's see what we can do. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but there's a couple other situations. Traveling or vacation, as Father Molini puts it, we've got branches all around the world, right? Now, if you are going to be like fishing in the wilderness in Canada, or out in the middle of Utah and the nearest Catholic church is 100 miles away, or in Saudi Arabia, right? Then you probably don't have an obligation to go to Mass on Sunday. But if you're just like in Miami, right? There's probably a Catholic church close enough that you can get to. And you do maintain, you continue that obligation to go to Mass on Sunday while you're on vacation. Sports do not lift the obligation. Children's sports don't lift the obligation to go to Mass on Sunday, right? That is a leisure activity. It's not necessary. It's not required. And we've got lots of Mass times, right? Bad weather. Again, I think the judgment is if you wouldn't go out to get to the store, then you probably are not obliged to go to Mass either, right? Bad weather can be really dangerous. And even things that wouldn't stop, say me, young, healthy guy, might stop someone who's more frail. So that can be a kind of, it might be different for different people. Where I might still go to Mass, someone else might not be obliged to go to Mass because of the conditions. One more that I'd like to talk about is being in the state of mortal sin. Some people think that if you're in a state of sin and therefore you can't receive Holy Communion, that you shouldn't go to Mass. That's exactly the opposite of the truth. You should always go to Mass on Sunday, even if you can't receive Holy Communion. We're obliged to go to Mass. We're not obliged to receive Holy Communion. Now, obviously, you should go to confession as soon as possible so that you can receive Holy Communion, but don't add another mortal sin on top of it
Right.
by failing
Right.
to go to Mass on Sunday.
Yeah.
And in fact, by your genuine and sincere going to Mass, worshiping God, that will help to prepare your soul to be really converted when you do get a chance to go to confession.
Yes, yes. Our obligation to go to Mass isn't to receive communion. It's very great when we can, but the primary reason is to offer ourselves with Christ to the Father.
So I'd like to finish just with one little practical thing. If you foresee a situation, either on a particular occasion or because of your work or kind of a standing obligation that you have, where you're not going to be able to get to Mass on Sunday, go talk to your pastor, because we pastors have the authority to dispense or to change, to commute the obligation to go to Mass on Sunday. So, for example, if someone comes to me and says, I'm going to be on vacation, it's going to be really hard for me to get to Mass on Sunday, I can say to them, okay, this Sunday, pray a rosary instead. And that's what now I've changed your obligation, right? A pastor has the authority to do that, so that can be very useful.